So with chapter 1.2, we're going to talk about chemistry in general. So chemistry is a subject, the type of things that you study in chemistry, all of that. So, there we go. Chemistry is a physical science, so it is the study of matter. So that might sound kind of just simple, but it's a lot of studying the composition, the structure, and the different properties of different types of matter, the processes that matter will undergo, so the different chemical reactions, and then the energy changes that accompany those chemical reactions. So there's actually a lot more than you might think when you just say it's the study of matter. So chemistry gets broken down into 6 major branches of chemistry. So first up you have organic chemistry. So you might have heard the term organic used with foods and things like that, organic growing methods. You wouldn't actually hear a chemist use those terms because organic just means that the compound contains carbon, which all living things, all of our food contains carbon. So it's kind of a weird term at the moment, but organic chemistry is the study of most carbon-containing compounds. And again, it is currently one of the most misused terms in chemistry. So in organic chemistry, you'll see things like this. We're not going to deal with that in this class. Just kind of giving you an example of what it looks like. So they deal with not only carbon-containing compounds, but also the reactions that take place with all these different carbon-containing compounds. And they do a lot of synthesis, which means they take simple compounds and try to make complex compounds. So that's how they can produce different compounds that are found in nature in low levels. They can figure out a way to kind of mass produce them. And that's how you get a lot of your medications. Next up you have inorganic chemistry. So this is the study of non-organic substances. So many of these compounds have some organic segments that are bonded to metals. So those are called organometallics. So they're both organic, but they also have the metal in them. So one example would be the hemoglobin proteins in your blood. They are organic proteins, organic compounds, but they do bind iron in the middle of them. And that's what binds to oxygen and helps transport your blood around, or oxygen around in your blood. So this is showing one of those organometallics. You actually have cobalt in the center here, so you can see it right there. And then you have your organic structure surrounding it. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting one. That's vitamin B12, and there are 2 different ways of looking at it here. Next up you have physical chemistry, or oftentimes called PChem. PChem sucks. That's from personal experience, but PChem is the study of properties and changes in matter. So oftentimes it deals with the relationship between those changes and the energy changes that go along with them. So there's a lot of calculations that go along with it. There's a lot of tracking the energy in each compound as these changes happen. So it's a little frustrating. This is actually showing kind of the thermodynamic changes or the temperature and energy changes involved with folding a protein. But anyway. Alright, then you get analytical chemistry. So analytical is the identification of the components and composition of materials. So basically they will take an unknown compound, one that has just been discovered, nobody knows what the structure is, and then they will kind of break down the compound in order to discover what it actually is, like the nitty-gritty of it, how it's composed. It is a newer branch of chemistry, and it's come along with the advancement of technology. So this is where you get a lot of different new technology, new machines to deal with, like NMR, mass spec, things like that. Okay. Yeah. It's also not really my favorite, but, and technically you could also put X-ray crystallography in with this, but then you have biochem. So obviously my favorite out of all of these different branches. It is the study of substances and processes that occur in living things. So basically with chemistry, you're usually dealing with the really, really small, and then with biology, you're dealing with cells, and that's usually cells and organelles, and that's usually about as small as you go. Biochem actually looks at where chemistry meets biology. So in that kind of gray area between compounds and then proteins. Okay, so we deal a lot with proteins, the structure of proteins, how they work, the different conditions in which they work, because most of the processes involved in a living cell are carried out by a variety of proteins. So there was actually a time when I was in college that I started calling proteins my imaginary best friends. It's because, you know, you get to know them pretty well. So this is a look at a certain type of protein. This is what's called a membrane-bound protein. So you have the cytoplasm here and the periplasm. This is channel protein. As you can see, this giant hole right in the middle here. It allows for the passage of different nutrients into and out of the cell, depending on what direction it's facing. But yeah, so this one is actually made up of several different proteins. So they have the different proteins generally are similar, if not identical proteins, but they're all organized in this spiral fashion here, or the circular fashion. So they have the different ones colored, different colors, but yeah. So we also talk about the interactions between proteins that form this kind of hierarchical structure. Then you have theoretical chemistry. So these are the people that generally are just sitting on their computers running simulations. They use mathematics and computers to understand the principles behind observed chemical behavior. So oftentimes they will run simulations on things and then kind of pass that information off to what's called a wet lab. So basically a lab that actually deals with the chemicals themselves to test them out. So they design and predict the properties of new compounds. So they can basically take a list of properties that they want a new compound to have, or a new like product or whatever to have, and then they can kind of work backwards to figure out how to incorporate those properties into what they're making. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into all of this, but it's pretty cool. This is how you get things like 3D printing, liquid 3D printing, stuff like that is through the theoretical chemists that they created. So when we start talking about chemistry, you always have to talk about chemicals. And this is another term that's often misused in popular culture today. People talk about chemical-free living and, oh, you don't want to be eating all those chemicals and yada, yada, yada. That just tells you how much they don't understand about what they're talking about, because any substance that has a definite composition is considered to be a chemical, meaning everything is a chemical. Okay, so chemicals got a couple different versions of a definition of what a chemical is here. Chemical, a form of matter that consists of molecules of the same composition and structure, cannot be separated into components by physical separation methods without breaking chemical bonds. Basically, a chemical is a combination of atoms. Okay, so that's what I meant when I said everything is a chemical. Can't really get around it, right? So proteins are chemicals, carbohydrates are chemicals, everything. You can have any number of atoms bonded or complex together. So that means that they're easier to separate, but they are still attached, just weakly attached. They can contain any element. Oftentimes you won't see radioactive elements in chemical combinations, but it is possible. And then in order to be called the same chemical, atoms of different elements must be in the same proportions to each other. So basically, if you're talking about water, it's always H2O. So 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. If you're talking about peroxide, it's H2O2. Okay, so you can even have the same type of elements, just in different proportions, and get a different compound, different chemical. So water will always be H2O. Hydrochloric acid will always be HCl, so 1 hydrogen and 1 chlorine. Chemicals can exist as solids, liquids, gases, plasma, or in some cases something called a supercritical fluid. We'll get into those more later. They can be combined or converted into different chemicals through chemical reactions. And again, everything around you is a chemical. Everything inside of you is also a chemical. So here we've got a couple videos that I've posted on the classroom. So thing to remember is that chemistry is not isolated to the lab or the classroom. So that's, a lot of people kind of think that, but I mean, if everything in the world is made up of chemicals, it's a little difficult to say that it's just in the classroom where you find chemistry. So this video is kind of looking at some of the accidental discoveries that were made in chemistry outside of the lab, or even inside the lab, but, you know, weren't supposed to happen. And then chemistry, actually, this is kind of a weird little fact about chemistry, but it has its roots in alchemy. So if you've seen Harry Potter, especially the first one, they talk about alchemy turning any metal into gold. And then we kind of have a way to somewhat sort of do that, which is actually one of the labs that we're going to do. It's actually called electroplating, so that's what the second video is about. And basically it's just coating a metal with another metal. So you can make it look like something turns into gold by electroplating it. So, but yeah, it's kind of interesting to talk about chemistry's roots in alchemy. They are the early chemists. The alchemists are the early chemists. So they weren't exactly right, but, you know. Alright, so chemistry of today looks very different from its beginnings, its roots. It is, of course, based on the scientific method. And then it's dependent on the ability to repeat experiments. So this is kind of that accuracy, precision thing. Accuracy, precision. If you can't repeat it, then you can't really have any faith in your results. Many advancements require the use of advanced technology, such as a TEM, it's a tunneling electron microscope, an atomic force microscope, AFM, or what are called Sanger sequencers. Those actually are what are used to DNA sequence things. So this is what a lab typically looks like, a chemistry lab looks like. Some chemicals you will have to store in like fridges or freezers, depending on its instability at room temperature. Okay, you do have your chemicals lined up on the shelves, and just different lab stations all throughout the lab. So labs are generally pretty large. This is one of those tunneling electron microscopes, a TEM. They are so precise and so delicate that oftentimes they have to be built into a very specific room that is isolated from the rest of the building. So basically it has a break in the floor with kind of vibration dampers that line that little section of the floor, so that any vibrations in the building are not felt by the microscope. Also have like vibration dampers throughout the room, so it basically looks like a recording studio with all of that on the walls. But this is an AFM. AFMs, they're specifically called atomic because they can actually image individual atoms, which is what you're seeing here. And then this is a Sanger sequencer that is looking at the DNA sequence of a sample. Alright, so that's the end of this section.